Hello and welcome. This is our 9th lecture, and it seems that it is going to be the final lecture during the state of emergency. So we will be continuing with the YouTube lectures, but I have some exciting news about your midterms and final exams, but more about it in the presentation. So let's go into the presentation. As I just mentioned, this is our 9th lecture, and if you think that, this is suboptimal, just think about the people who need to graduate this year and they cannot have proper celebrations. They have issues with finalizing their thesis and so on. So being a first year student in the pandemic is not the worst option, I think. When it comes to time, let's forget about the, you know, nasty stuff about this pandemic. Let's focus on our course. So we are spot on. Today we will finish the simple sentence, introduce some basic concepts of the complex sentence, and over the next two classes we will fundamentally finish the course, so that in the last week of May we only do a wrap up and I present to you some of the tricks and tips for the oral exam, as well as tips and tricks for the written exam. And now some exciting news. So as you can see here, we now are almost 100% sure that, contrary to our initial expectations, there will be the April examination period, but it will happen in May. So if you had to take some, exams or get your oral exams done in April, this is going to happen. And on top of that, we know that we are looking for a suitable week, probably the last week of May, to do midterms. So there will also be the midterms. So in other words, the presentation that I uploaded to YouTube about the midterm now becomes more relevant, because this is definitely happening, and the June examination term will happen according to the original schedule, so in June. For all other questions, the chat sessions, office chat sessions, you got the invite, so feel free to join and ask. We are here for you, and we are here to answer all your questions. So very briefly, what we did last week was a simple sentence, and we introduced the concept of a sentence and the concept of a clause, where we said that sentence is fundamentally the topmost, the biggest syntactic unit, whereas clause is its main building block. And every sentence is a clause, but not all clauses are sentences. So in order for a clause to be a sentence, it has to be finite and it has to be independent. All other clauses are fundamentally subordinate clauses that perform functions of sentence elements in a main clause. Then we discussed verb valency, and we discussed the fact that valency is not transitivity, but actually valency represents an overarching term which implies transitivity, but is more than that. So valency is fundamentally the feature of each verb, that the verb decides what sentence elements it can take, but also in what form these elements should be realized. So some verbs do not tolerate that clauses as objects, but will happily accept noun phrases as objects. So this is actually valency. In simple terms, it's about verbs being picky what they take as their obligatory elements. That brought us to the discussion of simple, complex, and compound sentences, where we said that simple sentence is fundamentally a sentence in which every sentence element is realized as a phrase, and there are no subordinate clauses functioning as elements of a simple sentence. Complex sentence contains at least one subordinate clause which functions as a sentence element, and compound sentences consist of two independent clauses or two complex sentences joined together. So compound sentences are either simple sentences joined together or complex sentences joined together with and, but, and or. And structure that you can encounter in terms of a simple sentence is always the same. I mean, there are actually only 7 types of simple sentences in terms of their internal organization, and this stems from the verbs. So every single simple sentence will be either SV, SV obligatory adverbial, SVC subject verb subject complement, SVO subject verb object, SVOO subject verb indirect and direct object, SVOC object and an object complement, or SVOA object and the obligatory adverbial. There can be many optional adverbials, but we don't count them as clause types. And then we discussed the fact that different sentence elements can have different forms. So a noun phrase can be a subject, but it can also be an object. And on top of that, clauses can also be, for example, subjects and objects. And we wrapped up everything with a discussion on Eric Hartman Killing Kenny, where we introduced semantic classification of sentences. So you should remember that a subject has the biggest number of semantic, let's say, functions that it can perform, whereas, for example, complements are always attributes of the subject or the object, resulting or current. Today, we will focus on only 3 things, Concord, negation, and the gentle introduction to complex sentences. So without any further ado, let's talk about Concord. When I say the word Concord, what probably springs to your mind is not a grammatical category, but this retired airplane. However, this is not Concord. This is Concord with an E, like Anne with an E, if you know the TV series. So unlike Concord with an E, Concord without an E is a grammatical category and not a supersonic plane. So Concord, if you get this in the oral exam, should be defined. And one of the best known definitions of Concord is that is actually agreement. So it's an agreement between two sentence elements with respect to certain grammatical features. This is, let's say, the basic definition. You have also a more elaborate definition, which is also listed in your workbook, which says that concord, also termed agreement as in the previous definition, is a grammatical relationship between two grammatical units, such that one of them displays a particular feature that accords with the displayed feature in the other unit. So what do we mean by that? So, for example, if you are a third person singular noun, let's say, or a pronoun like he, the fact that he is a third person singular will be displayed on the verb by means of the s suffix. That's actually what concord is. You see the relationships between units through some displayed or implicit features in other units. This is like the invisible link where different parts of the sentence are in agreement. In Serbian, this comes naturally. We have a lot of concord and everything agrees in our sentences. In English, you may think that we will run through this section after 2 or 3 slides, but you are actually wrong, because there are many, not maybe many, there are several types of concord even in English. Let me explain. When we say that there are several types of concord, we have to actually find evidence that there is concord. So where can we see concord in English? We can see it in the following sentences which are ungrammatical. Mary were in London yesterday is terribly ungrammatical. So is John cut herself, and John cut themselves, and John is an actress is also probably ungrammatical unless John is a drag queen. John considers Bill an actress is, by the same logic, also most likely ungrammatical. And this is ungrammatical in every context. John considers them an actor. So why are these sentences ungrammatical? Because there's something wrong with concord, and these examples of ungrammaticality actually show you where exactly you can see concord. So the first one displays a problem in subject-verb concord, and the problem is person and number. So Mary is third person and it's singular, but the verb is in plural. John cut herself shows you that there's also subject-object concord, and here the main problem is gender. John cut himself would be okay. Person and number are actually okay. The problem why the sentence is ungrammatical is actually gender. John cut themselves, gender is probably okay if you're being politically correct. The problem is actually in number. John is an actress, shows you the subject complement concord, where you again see that gender is a relevant feature. And in John considers Bill an actress, you have the same situation, but between object and the object complement. In the final example, we are still in the domain of object and object complement concord, but here the ungrammaticality stems from the issues in number. So John considers them actors, would be okay. This brings us to actually good classification of number, gender, person, and subject, verb, object, complement as main terms in describing concord. So based on these examples, linguists figure out that there are fundamentally two types of concord with three subtypes in each of the main types. So the first classification of concord can be based on the sentence element that displays concord, whereas the second classification can be based on grammatical features, so gender, number, person, and sentence element, subject, verb, subject, complement, and so on. So that's exactly the classification. So depending on sentence element, you have fundamentally only three subtypes of concord. That's subject, verb concord, subject, complement concord, which can be, again, based on different grammatical features, and object and the object complement concord. And this concord has to actually distinguish between the following grammatical features, and they are number, so singular versus plural, person, first, second, third, and of course gender, which is masculine, feminine, and neuter gender, usually visible in the third person. So we have to say something about each of these types of concord, and we also have to provide some examples, which is also what you have to do if you get this in the oral exam. So let's focus on the subject-verb concord, and let's talk about noun phrases in the subject-verb concord. So here are two examples which should actually explain the most common type of concord. So subject verb is, let's say, what most people know if they know something about concord. And as the subject can often be a noun phrase, you can see here that the general rule is that depending on the head. So whether the head is single, like the change, or it's plural, like changes, the verb will agree with the head of the noun phrase. So the general rule, the default rule is when the subject is a noun phrase, the phrase counts as singular if the head is singular. If the head is plural, the verb will be plural. However, as you know from the previous lecture, the subject is not necessarily always a noun phrase. It can also be an adverb phrase or a prepositional phrase. So when the subject is an adverb phrase and the prepositional phrase, you have examples here. Slowly does it in the evenings is best for me. And as you can see, the Concord is in those cases singular. So we could say that it seems that the default concord is singular. So if there's a noun phrase and the head is singular, the concord is singular. If the head is plural, the noun phrase, the concord is plural. But if you don't have a noun phrase, but an adverb phrase or a prepositional phrase, then you simply use singular as the default. But let's test this theory that the default concord is singular with the fourth possibility in terms of the subject, because subjects are not necessarily only noun phrases, adverb phrases, preposition phrases. Subjects can also be clauses, and here you have some examples. How they got there doesn't concern me. To treat them as hostages is criminal. Smoking cigarettes is dangerous to your health. Based on these examples, it seems that our initial hypothesis is actually correct. It seems that finite and non-finite clauses generally count as singular. And these are the general rules, but this being grammar and this being language, you know that there will be some exceptions, of course. So let's look at the exceptions, and you find them in subjects that are realized as clauses that start with a WH word. So what were supposed to be new proposals were in fact modifications of earlier ones. What was once a palace is now a pile of rubble. Whatever book a Times reviewer praises sells well. What ideas he has are his wife's. As you can see, here we seem to have a divergence from the original rule that we formulated just one slide ago, that whenever you have a clause, it should be singular. The reason why we have this divergence is that these are not typical nominal clauses in the subject positions. These are nominal relative clauses. As you can see, they all start with a WH element. And how you interpret the number of this clause, how you actually treat it, depends on what the WH element determines. So what were supposed to be new proposals, what refers to proposals. Proposals are plural, so the verb is plural. What was once a palace, what refers to a palace, which is singular, the verb is singular. Whatever book a Times review praises, so here it refers to a book, it's singular. What ideas he has, ideas are in plural, so the verb is plural. And that's the rule. So generally, clauses are always singular unless you have a relative clause, nominal relative clause in the subject position, then the WH element, or actually what the WH element refers to, will determine the concord. And that allows us to formulate the general rules of subject-verb concord. So a subject which is not clearly plural will always take a singular verb. So our initial hypothesis is actually a good one. Singular is actually the unmarked form, and you use it in neutral circumstances. And this is also the explanation why in everyday conversations you often hear examples such as there is hundreds of people in the street, although you should say there are hundreds. Why this happens? Because the singular is the default concord unless you have a clear plurality marked somewhere in the subject. Of course, there are additional exceptions apart from nominal relative clauses, and they include some nouns in the subject position, in particular singular nouns that end in s, like measles, and also plural nouns like people that actually lack the s. So this also includes, for example, cattle. So measles is sometimes serious, and other exceptions are also some of them listed in your workbook. One of the famous example is Crime and Punishment is a great novel. Brother Karamazov is his masterpiece. The Cedars has a huge garden, and senior citizens means people over 60. So when you deal with subjects that are noun phrases and are plural noun phrases, if those plural noun phrases are names, quotations, titles, or meta language, like you're using language to talk about language. So senior citizens, here you think this noun phrase, singular, means people over 60. Then you use the actually singular Concord, the default Concord, because in your mind this reads as singular. And some people say that the reason why we do this is that in our mind these structures are actually like apositive structures. Like when you say Crime and Punishment, you actually mean the book Crime and Punishment is a great novel. And you know that literature is really rich in ideas and different titles. So some of these titles refer to more than one, let's say, element within a book. And you are very familiar, for example, with the Canterbury Tales. In this case, when the title refers to collection of stories, collection of poems, etc., you can use both the singular or the plural depending on whether you treat the Canterbury Tales as a single work of art or a collection of individual stories. So this discussion on the subject-verb concord introduce you to the idea of the default concord being singular and the plural concord being marked, and exceptions in terms of relative clauses and plural noun phrases in the subject position. But this also introduces you to another concept. So it's not always, as you can see in the Canterbury Tales or Brother, in the previous example, Brother Karamazov, it's not always important just how the noun phrase looks like. It's also important how you interpret the noun phrase. And that actually is an additional force within the grammatical relation of concord, and that's notion and proximity. So sometimes what you saw was grammatical concord, but sometimes this grammatical concord gives, gives its place to the logic that simply you have to understand that something that looks like plural is actually singular. And this is notional concord. And then we will also introduce proximity. So look at this example. No one except his own supporters agree with him. If you think about this phrase, the head is the one that's italicized. No one. That's actually the head. Except his own supporters is actually a prepositional phrase which post-modifies this head. Yet the verb is not agrees, the verb is agree. So the reason why this happens is called proximity. You could say that the verb is in a way lazy. The verb doesn't want to look to the head. The verb is looking back, trying to see metaphorically speaking, what it can agree with. So the verb is by default looking for a head of a noun phrase, which is a noun. So in this first part of the sentence, there is a noun, supporters, and there is a pronoun, no one. No one is at the beginning, far away from the verb. Supporters is immediately next to the verb. So this is also called attraction, and it simply means that the verb will sometimes agree with the preceding noun phrase, irregardless of the head of the noun phrase. And in this particular example, you also have this notional concord, because no one except his own supporters fundamentally means something like plural, like only his own supporters agree with him. So in your mind, no one except his own supporters is more than one person. So not only is, the head of the noun phrase far away from the verb, it's also that the whole noun phrase means something that is in plural, and that's actually the idea of notional concord. You, as a speaker or a listener, you don't think of a noun phrase just in terms of its form and grammatical number. You also understand this noun phrase as being singular or plural, irregardless of its raw grammatical form. So let's look at some examples of notional concord. So if you are talking about money, this is very common. So for example, you could say that you're broke and you say $3 is all I have left. $3, strictly speaking, is plural, but you never say $3 are all I have left, because in your mind, $3 means the amount of $3 is all I have left. With years and with different, numerical expressions, this is also quite common. So 15 years represents a long period of his life. Strictly speaking, it's plural. But in your mind, this reads as the period of 15 years is a long period of life. And measurements that are also, here you have a measurement of time, but measurement of space belongs to the same notional category. So when you say 2 miles is as far as they can walk, you actually mean the distance of 2 miles is as far as they can walk. So this applies also to general numerical expressions like fractions. 2/3 of the area is underwater, which you read in your mind as the area of 2/3 is underwater. And general everyday expressions with numbers like 60 people, that number of people, although 60 people is officially plural, in your mind this reads like the number, that number of people means a huge party. So these are all examples of notional concord, and these things are constantly in interaction. So on the one hand, you have grammatical concord, which tells you agree with the head of the noun phrase. But the notional and proximity concord increase their, let's say, power as the noun is further away from the verb phrase. So when you have an adverbial between the subject and the verb, when you add discourse markers between the subject and the verb, when you create a long stretch of language between subject and the verb, the chances are that instead of grammatical concord, you will be allowed to use proximity more easily. So that means that proximity as a form of concord usually occurs in unplanned everyday discourse, spoken discourse. So in speaking, in writing, you always somehow even subconsciously revert to the grammatical concord. Now, in the next slides, we will discuss grammatical concord, notional concord, and proximity and their interplay in collective noun heads, coordinated subjects, and indefinite expressions. So let's look at collective nouns. These are nouns such as the public, or in this example, the audience, but also countries like England, when England actually refers to the club, not the club, to the national team here, or even, governing bodies like ARC Planning Committee. As you can see, they here have the plural concord. So the audience were, the public are, England have, which means the team, the national football team of England, let's say, and our planning committee. So plural somehow seems to be the default rule for collective nouns, because after all, England means 11 people who kick the ball. The public is definitely more than one. The audience is probably more than one. Committee, by definition, more than one. But in British English, actually, this is open to discussion. So in British English, these collective nouns can also be singular. So you can find examples such as the audience was enormous, the public consists of you and me, and the crowd has been dispersed. So in British English in particular, you have a choice whether to use collective nouns with the singular or the plural verb, depending on how you see the collective noun, whether you see it as an undivided body or entity or a collection of individuals. So when you say the crowd has been dispersed, you don't even think of individuals within the crowd as real human beings. You are just in the mode of crowd control. But if you say the crowd have been dispersed, it means that you are maybe a better person who thinks of the crowd as a group of many individuals. On the whole, at least in British English, but also in American, where the plural is like the first choice, we can say that the plural is generally then more popular in speech, whereas in writing, especially British English, the singular is sometimes, especially in formal context, more preferred. But that was just collective nouns. I promised you a discussion on three aspects. The next group of, let's say, examples where we analyze the notion of concord and the interplay between notion proximity and the grammatical concord are coordinated subjects. Coordinated subject simply means that the subject has more than one, so two or more noun phrases, but they can be also clauses. And those structures in the subject are coordinated by the conjunction or the coordinator and. In those cases, we have to distinguish two possibilities. One is proper coordination, and the other is something called coordinative apposition. Proper coordination is like real coordination. Tom and Alice are now ready. So Tom and Alice, 1 + 1 = 2, that's plural, which means Tom is now ready and Alice is now ready. The thing I say and the thing I think are my own affair. The same logic applies, that the thing I say is my own affair and the thing I think is my own affair. So coordination proper implies that in your mind you analyze the subject, the coordinated subject, as something that you can paraphrase in this way. So Tom is now ready and Alice is now ready. The thing I say is my own affair and the thing I think is my own affair. But if you create a coordinated subject that is shorter, so you shorten things for the sake of simplicity. So instead of saying the thing I say and the thing I think, instead of that, for example, you say the thing I say and do, not the thing I say and the thing I do. Then, because of this ellipses in the subject position, you go back to the default Concord, which is singular. So the general rule is when you have full coordination, you use plural, because in your mind that reads like full forms. But when you have reduced forms, when you do some ellipses in the coordinated subject, so the thing I say and do, then you revert to the singular form. So but if you have full coordination, plural verb is used even if each conjoint is singular. Uh, so examples also include something like his camera, his phone, his money were confiscated. So what this shows you is that even when there is no coordinator, with proper coordination, you go to the plural. And sometimes for the sake of, dynamic expression, the coordinator and is omitted, especially in novels, thrillers. Your problem and mine are similar, which again is your problem is similar to mine and mine is similar to yours, but what I say and do are two different things. So what I say is one thing and what I do is another thing. So this shows you a subset of coordination which expresses mutual relationship. And those conjoints, as we call them, are always plural. So mutual relationships are always plural. But coordination, especially this proper coordination, is a tricky issue. So let me show you with some examples. Every adult and every child was holding a flag. Each senator and congressman was allocated 2 seats. Each of them has signed the petition. So it looks like here, each implies that you have singular concord. But if you put each in a different position, which is not at the beginning, something like they have each signed allocated 2 seats, then you can have plural. So what this means is that each and every, when they are in the initial position, which the official term is preposed, so they are in the initial position, the fancy word is preposed. Preposed and each and every have a distributive effect and require a singular verb. And that brings us to the last aspect of coordination, and that's coordinative apposition, which is best exemplified by the following sentences. This temple of ugliness and memorial to Victorian bad taste was erected in the main street of the city. So this subject is singular because it's a single thing, right? This temple of ugliness is also at the same time a memorial to Victorian bad taste. So this is like also notional concord. You interpret this as referring to the same thing. But if you say his aged servant and the subsequent editor of his collected papers was with him at his deathbed, you can also say his aged servant and the subsequent editor of his collected papers were with him at his deathbed. So one of these is proper coordination. The other is appositive coordination. So you use singular if the servant and the editor are the same, like this temple of ugliness and memorial to Victorian bad taste. So if his aged servant is also the same person as the subsequent editor, you use the singular. And this is appositive coordination. But if his aged servant is not the same person as his subsequent editor, if these are two different people, then you have proper coordination, and as you know from the previous slide, you use the plural for proper coordination. And this is actually the explanation. So in the Apositive coordination, the whole subject is interpreted as a single thing. This is like having a relative clause we just described. So his aged servant, who also happened to be the subsequent editor of his collected paper, was. But his aged servant and another person, the subsequent editor, then you use were. And at the very end of this long section on coordination and also generally Concord in English, let's focus on coordination with or and nor. So you know this as one of the common mistakes. You probably did this in your earlier studies. So either the mayor or his deputy is bound to come. What I say or what I think is no business of yours. Either the strikers or the bosses have misunderstood the claim, but either your brakes or your eyesight is at fault. And especially indicative is the fifth one. If you change the order and say either your eyesight or your brakes, then you say are at fault. So what these examples show you is that coordination with either or and neither nor, there is pure grammatical concord if they are both singular, like in 1 and 2. So the verb is singular when they are both singular. When they are both plural, which is example number 3, the verb is also plural. But when these conjoins, the coordinated item, do not have the same number, so when you have, like in 4 and 5, one is singular, the other is plural, or the first is plural, the other is singular, then you no longer follow the general grammatical concord, you follow proximity. And whichever phrase comes last, which means whichever phrase comes closest to the verb, that noun phrase determines the number. So 1, 2, and 3 are pure grammatical concord, both singular, the verb singular, both plural, the verb is plural. But if they are different, then you use proximity. So in addition to neither either or, neither nor, this also applies to not but, not only but, and all similar constructions. The last part, which I promised, the subtypes of the analysis of grammatical concord, notional concord, and proximity interplay, is actually indefinite expressions in the subject position. So there are many indefinite pronouns such as anyone, anybody, no one, nobody. And there are also nouns of dual gender, like student, teacher, it can be a he or a she. And in English, at least grammatically, there are 3 ways how you can refer to them. The old way of doing this is to use something called unmarked he. This is now considered sexist. Everyone thinks he has the answer to that question, where everyone can also actually refer to feminine gender, entities. So it can be either a man or a woman, in other words. So this is now considered sexist, and another way that you can do it is to use he or she, which is okay but clumsy. Someone has to make up his or her mind. So what you can hear in the media these days, especially in the United States, is they. So everyone thinks they have the answer, or nobody called, did they? And also every applicant should hand in their application form. And this politically correct they is nowadays considered to be the best and the primary choice for indefinite pronouns and nouns of dual gender, because it's politically correct. And with that, we actually finished the whole section on Concord, and this was probably the longest section that we have had on a single topic in this course. So I will do something that I don't always do, especially with shorter topics. I will give you a summary of what we just said. So when it comes to Concord, the summary is that English actually has Concord, although it's relatively hidden. And there are two types of Concord, depending on sentence element and depending on grammatical features. So depending on sentence element, in English, you can see concord between the subject and the verb, the subject and the subject complement, and the object complement. And this concord between sentence elements takes into consideration three grammatical features: number, person, and gender. And these, basic types of concord are, let's say, grammatically defined. But on top of these grammatical bases of concord, there are two additional, let's call them forces in concord. They are proximity and also notional concord. So proximity simply means that as your subject noun phrase grows bigger and as the head of the noun phrase in the subject position becomes further and further away from the main verb, you may agree with the closest noun phrase. So proximity simply is about verbs being lazy, or maybe humans being lazy and not looking for the head of the noun phrase, but letting verbs agree with the closest noun inside a big noun phrase, not necessarily the head noun. Notional concord is about logic and interpretation. So the government can be a single body that you see, like a single body that rules the country, or you can think of it as a group of individuals, and then you can choose whether to use, say, the government is or the government are, especially in British English. And we also discussed what happens when you have coordinated subjects with and how the default grammatical agreement is to actually use plural if there are two things, but if you have reduced forms, to take the singular. And then we discuss coordinative apposition. So this is not proper coordination. This is the old servant and the subsequent editor, whether they are the same or the different persons. And finally, collective nouns, which have actually weird concord because of political correctness. You should use they. Weird in terms of ungrammatical but politically correct. And with that, we finished the concord. Now, the next topic will be shorter, and it's about negation. So it's something a bit different, rather negative. So negation. No, not, but also, you can express it visually with other symbols. So let's talk about basic information. If you get this in the oral exam, what do you say? You first have to give a definition. What is negation? Well, negation is not really a linguistic category. Negation, if you think about it, you probably first encounter it in your primary school, but in mathematics. So negation is a logical operation. It simply implies the opposite or absence of something that without this negation you think is positive or affirmative. So in English and in general, there are, fundamentally several types of negation. The first one is clause negation. The whole clause is synthetically treated as negative. You can see that thanks to the question tag. So you can say Rosie is not an attractive elephant in any way. Is she? Of course, Rosie here refers to this Rosie, the elephant from the movie. Water for Elephants, if you have not seen it, very romantic, nice movie. Also, I have a different, screenshot here. This is actually the book. But it doesn't have to be, focused on the whole clause. The negation can also be locally focused on a single sentence element. So this is called local negation. And this usually happens in speech, where you can emphasize something. When you chat, you probably do this with capitalized letters. So nothing is a better word in this sentence. So it's not that the whole sentence is negative. You are just writing suggestion to a friend of yours, and then you emphasize. Nothing is a better word in this sentence. And finally, there's a phrasal negation, which means that you are not focusing on a sentence element, you're actually focusing on maybe a single phrase inside a sentence element. And this is, relatively common again in everyday spoken communication. This is something like, she gave me not even a moment to somehow to collect my thoughts. The last type, which is again, dependent on pronunciation, is predication negation. It's relatively rare, and it only happens with certain auxiliaries, like modal ones. And a good example is, they may not go swimming. So this is not, you will not pronounce it as they may not go swimming, which would mean they are not allowed to go swimming. They may not go swimming, with this pause between may and not, and the change in stress implies that they are allowed not to go swimming, for example, because it's raining. And as you can see in all these examples, these four types of negation are realized through negative items. So negative items are what makes it possible to express negation. So the clause can be negated either by negating the verb, which is verbal negation, or you can negate it by negating other sentence elements. But if this is not the negation on the verb, we call it non-verbal negation. And this non-verbal negation allows you to, negate different sentence elements. And because there are many different sentence elements, there are many different negative items. So for the verbal negation, you generally use a single word, not. Not is considered a negative particle for the verbal negation. He does not drink, she's not a model wife, and this not can be merged with the auxiliary into a short form. He doesn't drink, she isn't a model wife, etc. But when it comes to other sentence elements, the choice is actually quite, exhaustive. So other sentence elements can be negated either by words which are really negative in both form and meaning. They are called nuclear negatives. Former President George W. Bush used to pronounce this word as nuclear, but don't do that. It's nuclear. So these are words like no, none, never, not. You can see and hear that they are negative. But there are also words which are negative in meaning, but they are not really negative in form. So they are like phantom menace, there are words like rarely, seldom, scarcely, barely, little, few. They mean something negative. Few means not enough, for example, and so does little. But they do not start with N. So these are, implicitly negative words. And this group includes verbs, adjectives, prepositions, such as, refuse, deny, fail, reluctant, without, against, unless. So these two groups require certain, let's say, explanation, and we will focus on nuclear negatives, so non-verbal, explicitly negative items, and how you can classify them. So here are some examples. Nobody came, none of the passengers were hurt, I saw nothing. I felt, none the worse. Not many people turned up. Not even the president of Pakistan was informed. I expect no reply. Neither team manager was informed. Neither today nor tomorrow is suitable, and elephants never forget, or we found nowhere to stay. So what do these examples show you? That nuclear negatives can be negative pronouns like nobody, none, and nothing. As soon as you see a part of speech that modifies an adjective, phrase, determiner, or an adverb, you know that we are talking about negative adverbs. So negative modifying adverbs are another type of nuclear negatives. No reply, neither team manager. This is inside a noun phrase. These are not adverbs. These are actually negative determiners. Neither today nor tomorrow. These are not determiners. They are actually coordinators. So nuclear negatives also include negative coordinators. And finally, negative adverbs, which function as sentence element, can negate the sentence or the clause, and they are then called negative adjuncts. So although these adjuncts can be like adverbs, but they can be longer. They can be also prepositional phrases or clauses. And this is actually the discussion on nuclear negatives and how they can be formed. But there are also negatives that are not, negatively formed. They are implicitly negative. These are, words like rarely, seldom, scarcely that have negative meaning, but are not really negative when you just look at them. So I seldom get any sleep. I've spoken to hardly anyone. Few changes in government have ever taken so many people by surprise. Only 2 of us had any experience in sailing. Rarely does crime pay so well as Mr. Ben seems to think. Little need I dwell upon the hope that she actually loves me. She scarcely seems to care for you, does she? So these examples are obviously negative. How can you know that? Because you remember from our very first lecture in Grammar 1 that the negative items are followed by non-assertive items like any, anyone, etc. So this actually proves that they are negative. So what proves that they are negative is that they are followed by non-assertive items. But what also proves that they are negative is that when you put them, like in rarely does crime pay so well, then you put them in the initial position, they cause what you know as negative inversion. And finally, what proves that these items are really negative is that they are followed by positive tag questions. So now you know that you can negate the sentence by a verbal or non-verbal negation, and then this gives you a choice in your everyday language use on how you are actually going to go about negating stuff. Generally, we can compare verbal negation and non-verbal negation. So let's look at some examples. We've had some lunch, that's assertive, and non-verbal negation, and then negative, normal. Not actually, the slide is wrong. This is not non-verbal. Now what you'll see is actually verbal negation. We haven't had any lunch. But if you compare this to a non-verbal negation, you can also say we had no lunch. If you have an assertive sentence, he saw one man or the other, you can negate it verbally or non-verbally. So he didn't see either man, or he saw neither man, which is unusual. And we've had some, can be we haven't had any, and we've had none. So as you can see here, the difference between negative meaning expressed through verbal negation and non-verbal negation seems to be relatively, the difference doesn't seem to be that big, in other words. in some instances, the non-verbal negation even sounds quite odd, like he saw neither man. But sometimes, if you compare some other examples, you can see that it's not always the case. So he saw one or other of the men. You can see he didn't see either of the men, or he saw neither of the men. I bought something for you. You can, with a verbal negation, you can say I haven't bought anything for you. But with a non-verbal negation, you end up with I've bought nothing for you. She sometimes visits me, she doesn't ever visit me, versus she never visits me. So what you can see in these examples, that in some instances, the non-verbal negation sends a more powerful negative meaning. So non-verbal negation in spoken language gives prominence and power to the negation. There is no time to be lost. He's no friend of mine. That's more powerful than saying, for example, he isn't a friend of mine. He's no friend of mine. That's like, mortal combat stuff, epic proportions. And that's the difference. So what you can actually say is that, especially in spoken language, the verbal negation is the default unmarked form. When you use non-verbal negation, you are actually emphasizing the negative message. So exactly what I said here is now shown in the slides. Non-verbal negation is actually emphasizing the negative message. No discussion on negation is complete without discussing, at least briefly, the topic of multiple negation. So, unlike most languages, English in its standard forms, British, American, Canadian, Australian, does not favor multiple negation. Only substandard varieties of English, like African American vernacular English, tolerate multiple negation. Examples like, yo, I'm telling you, man, nobody ain't seen nothing. So in normal circumstances, when you're not using substandard variety, you should always introduce a single negation that is then followed throughout the rest of the clause by one or more non-assertive items. So I haven't said anything to anybody yet, not I haven't said nothing to nobody, never, which would be a normal sentence, for example, in Serbian. However, what you have to also bear in mind is that this is a new development in English, and English originally did tolerate multiple negations. So based on that, and based on simply the fact that sometimes you need multiple negation for some logical expressions, or some, to describe something, it is possible to negate elements in different parts of the sentence. So it's possible to have two negations, but they operate in two parts of the sentence. They're like independent. So I can't not obey is one example, and not many people have nowhere to live is another example. No one, has nothing to offer to society, and not many Spaniards have no knowledge of bullfighting. And, these philosophical ones, like nobody here has never at any time told a lie, and neighbors should not be uncooperative. The fact that you can say this, the fact that you can have multiple negations in the sentence because they operate locally, means that there is something else about negation, and that something is called scope of negation. Scope of negation allows sentences to be grammatical with multiple negative items. So the scope of negation is not something that is ungrammatical, and it's not something like, these songs with multiple negations, which for some reason do not want to play now. Yeah, doesn't work, sorry. The scope of negation is simply the feature of the English language, but most other languages as well, that you can use pronunciation and pauses so to in order to actually change the scope over which the negative meaning operates in a sentence. Originally, the negative, without any emphasis, the negative meaning stretches from the negative item to the end of the clause, but not necessarily the end of the sentence, to the end of the negated phrase if you focus your negation on a single phrase, or to the beginning of the final adjunct. You may ask me now why this represents such a big deal. Well, it represents a big deal because you can change the meaning of the whole sentence by changing the position of the negative item. So you can influence the meaning, and that's the big deal. So look at this. At the bottom of the slide, you have oysters. You either love oysters or you hate them. You may say that they are disgusting. If you have spent many summers at the seaside in Montenegro, Croatia, or somewhere else, you know that, let's say, fishermen like to eat oysters and they eat them raw. So you belong to either one of the two groups of people, those that eat oysters and those that will much rather die than eat an oyster. And believe it or not, this sentence can be pronounced in two different ways so that it actually covers both types of people, those who love oysters and those who hate oysters. And the fact that you can do that stems from the use of scope of negation. So if you use, let's say, if you say, nothing agrees with me more than oysters, you mean to say that there is nothing else that I like more than oysters. So nothing agrees with me more than oysters. So it's like my favorite dish. But if you pronounce it just slightly differently and say, nothing agrees with me more than oysters, what you're trying to say is, I would much rather eat nothing than eat oysters. The reason why this happens is that you're using pronunciation to change the scope of negation. So with no particular pronunciation, in the standard pronunciation, you get the original meaning. So nothing agrees with me more than oysters. There's nothing else that I would much rather eat than oysters. But if you emphasize nothing, then you are changing the scope of negation. You're reducing it to the first element, and you say, I would much rather eat nothing than oysters. This is, let's say, an extreme example. The basic example is obvious when you simply look at the position of, the negative particle not, which makes it possible to make verbal negation. If you put the definitely in front of the negation, you will have a completely different meaning of the sentence than if you put the adverbial behind the negation. So I definitely didn't speak to him. It is definite that I did not speak to him. I did not definitely speak to him means that maybe I did talk, but nothing definite came out of it. So maybe we didn't agree. And the reason why we have these differences of meaning is that in one sentence, definitely is outside the scope of negation, but in the second sentence, definitely is within the scope of negation. But as I mentioned, scope of negation in real life can be realized through nuclear stress. You emphasize a particular word in the sentence, and that's the difference between I wasn't listening all the time which means for the whole time I wasn't listening. And when you say I wasn't listening all the time, so I was listening some of the time, but not all the time. The reason why you have the difference is that in the first sentence, the the scope of negation extends to the final adverbial, which I told you in the first slide on this scope of negation. But in the second sentence, due to this stress, you actually make the negation extend to the end of the sentence. In other words, depending on how you pronounce this, the final adjunct may or may not lie uh, within or outside the scope of negation. So you can see that when you compare sentences such as I didn't listen to some of them and I didn't listen to any of them. So you know that negative item not should trigger a non-assertive item any, like in the second sentence. But in the first sentence, you are actually, the fact that you use some here means that you were playing with the scope of negation. So you're actually trying to say that there were some of the speakers that I didn't listen to, but I actually listened to some others. I didn't listen to any of them. This is the standard scope of negation to the end of the clause. So there were not any speakers that I listened to. So this is actually how you can play with the scope of negation. So if an assertive item is used in an adjunct, that means that the adjunct is outside the scope of negation. So sometimes you can do this even in writing, because using assertive items allows you to change the focus of negation. You cannot, of course, in writing resort to the stress. But in spoken communication, you often use exactly this special stress, which we call the focus of negation. So this is what allows you to pronounce one and the same sentence in at least several ways. Like, I didn't take the grammar exam last week. I took maybe phonetics exam. I didn't take the grammar exam last week. I took, for example, a midterm. I didn't take the grammar exam last week. I took it 2 weeks ago. Or I didn't take the grammar exam last week. I took it last month. And that is actually the focus of negation. So it's special, some people say contrastive, nuclear stress that you place on a particular part of a clause, indicate that the negation is fundamentally located at that spot, and the rest of the clause can be understood to be positive. So what you can do then is you can actually split the scope of negation with the focus of negation, so that the negation and the scope of negation becomes discontinuous. So you always have the scope of negation where you have the negative item. But for example, if you say, I didn't take John to swim in the pool today, you forgot to take John to swim in the pool today. That's like standard following intonation. But if you say, I didn't take John to swim in the pool today, it implies that you did take somebody. So the scope of negation no longer stretches to the end of the sentence. You are actually saying that you didn't take John, you took Mary, but you did take somebody to swim in the pool instead. So you see, that's what you are doing. So with the focus of negation, you actually split this long stretch of negation, the standard default negation, into two chunks. Similarly, you can say, I didn't take John to swim in the pool today. For example, I took her to see the pool, but not to swim in it. Or I didn't take John to swim in the pool today. I took her to the lake to swim today. So in all these instances, by using the focus of negation, you are splitting the scope of negation into two smaller chunks. And of course, there are multiple other possibilities. So you can, for example, focus on the final adjunct. You can say, I didn't take John to swim in the pool today. I took her there 2 weeks ago or last week. Or you can even focus on the subject. I did not take John to swim in the pool today. It was my sister, it was my brother, it was my mother who took John to swim in the pool today. So you can see that in all these instances, you actually use the focus of negation to split the scope of negation into smaller chunks. So in other words, scope and focus of negation are interrelated, and one way of signaling the extent of the scope of negation is by the position of the focus intonation. And then you have, exams, for example, for actors at the Academy of Arts, that, they ask students there at the entrance exam to come up with 3 or 4 or 7 different pronunciations for a single sentence. So I didn't leave home because I was afraid of my father is not the same as I didn't leave home because I was afraid of my father. So you can pronounce in 2 ways to let's say, indicate that because I was afraid of my father, I didn't leave home, or I left home, but it wasn't because I was afraid of my father. Similarly, she didn't come to see him when he asked, so when he asked, she didn't come to see him. She didn't come to see him when he asked. So she came to see him, but not at the time when he asked her to come and see him. And with these examples, we finish the large section on negation. And the only thing remaining for us to do over the next 5 or 6 minutes is to give a gentle introduction to complex sentences. Why? Because you actually know this introduction. We talked about it when we talked about the simple sentence. So let's look at these 2 examples. Last night, in the pitch black darkness of a moonless night, around midnight, an amazingly wonderful thing happened to a little girl from Rosary Gardens in her pink-colored room in the vicinity of Sheffield. And let's compare it to I want to sleep. Which of these sentences is a complex sentence? Judging by the size, you would say the first one, but actually it's the second one, because in the first sentence there are no subordinate clauses. Last night is a noun phrase. In the pitch black darkness of a moonless night, PP. Around midnight, PP. An amazing and wonderful thing is a subject. Happened, verb. To a little girl from Rosary Garden, prepositional phrase, no clause. In her pink-colored room in the vicinity of Sheffield, complex prepositional phrase. But I want to sleep contains the main clause, I want, and the subordinate clause, to sleep. So you know this. You know that sentences are classified on the basis of the number and type of clauses. We talked about it in the previous lecture. So there are simple, complex, and compound sentences. And as we discussed this, a simple sentence means that there is a single independent main clause. And all sentence elements are phrases. So the members did not know the scope of the problem. S is an NP, verb is a verb phrase, and object is a noun phrase. Complex sentence means that one main clause is, the basis, or let's say the container into which you put a subordinate clause. So one sentence element is realized as a dependent clause. So the member, subject, noun phrase, verb phrase, know, and the object is a clause, that the problem has a wide scope. You can say the members know the truth. This is still SVO, but in this example, the object is now a clause, and therefore this is a complex sentence because one sentence element is realized as a clause. The sentence element doesn't have to be an obligatory one. you have a complex sentence if an adverbial, an optional adverbial, is realized as a clause. So the members knew the answer when the chairman asked. You would say that this is also a complex sentence because one of the sentence elements is a clause. Compound sentences represent the third possibility, and that simply means that it's not about one main clause and one or more subordinate or dependent clause. It's actually about at least two independent main clauses. So she took the test in June and she passed it easily. So these are two main clauses. Each is a nice simple sentence. She took the test in June, period. She passed it easily. You simply use and, but, and or as coordinators, and you create a compound sentence. Another example is Mary likes dogs, but she doesn't like hamsters, etc. So the main thing about complex and compound sentences is what they do to connect to other clauses and what they use to connect to other clauses to either combine a compound or complex sentence. So this means that linkers, these elements that do that, they are called linkers, are very important. So linkers are syntactic items which link to syntactic elements. But these linkers are not the same. Depending on what type of syntactic elements they link, they can be divided into two groups. You already know conjuncts from our discussion on adverbials. They are linkers for sentences. You have a sentence, he studied hard, and you have a sentence, he didn't pass the exam. If you put however at the beginning of he didn't pass the exam, you create a link to the previous sentence, but you're not creating a complex or the compound sentence. You are simply creating discourse link to the previous sentence. You're creating some kind of cohesion in your discourse. Conjunctions are linkers that link clauses, and they can be divided into coordinators. They are the ones that create, let's say, compound sentences, and subordinators like if, although, that, when. They create subordinate clauses. Coordinators are only three: and, but, and or. Subordinators, there are many of them. We don't say that subordination and coordination is the process of linking necessarily clauses. We say that they are processes of linking two syntactic units, and we say that they are hierarchical. In subordination, units are not on the same syntactic level. In coordination, they are at the same syntactic level. So these are hierarchical relationships or processes of linking syntactic units. Why do we say syntactic units? Why do we not say clauses? Because when it comes to coordination, at least, subordination is different, but when it comes to coordination, coordination doesn't apply only to clauses. As you saw in our discussion on Concord, Mary and Bob, what I say and what I do, you can link clauses, but you can also link phrases with a coordinator. So phrases and clauses can both be coordinated with and, but, and or, but they cannot be subordinated. And that's why it's better to say syntactic units and not clauses. So we will wrap up today's class with a brief overview of these relationships: subordination, coordination. Subordination is a non-symmetrical relationship. It means that two clauses are hierarchically different. One is the main clause, the other it's subordinate clause, it's constituent. So this is something like they think, this is the main clause, and then you have a subordinate clause that she can succeed if she tries hard enough. What you can see here is that inside the subordinate clause you can have another subordinate clause which is if she tries hard enough. So the main clause is subject, verb, object. The object is realized as that she can succeed if she tries hard enough. But this object clause itself has its own clause as an adverbial if she tries hard enough. And each of these clauses has its own structure. We know this. This is, of course, recursion. Subordination is recursive. You can embed a subordinate clause into subordinate clause, and then in that subordinate clause there can be another subordinate clause. And this is a well-known fact. If you look at this in a tree diagram, this is actually what we mean by hierarchy. They think that she can succeed if she tries hard enough. These clauses are on different levels. They think is on the top, it takes an object. This object is that she can succeed if she tries hard enough, but that she can succeed has its own adverbial, which is a clause. Coordination is completely different. It's not asymmetrical, it's a symmetrical relation between two clauses of equal status or two phrases of equal status. Equal status here means that they can be either main clauses that can be coordinated, or you can coordinate subordinate clauses. Both are possible. So if you coordinate main clauses, you create a compound sentence. She took the test and she passed it. She took the test, simple, finite, independent clause. She passed it, simple, finite, independent clause. You take and, join them, and you create a compound sentence, and that's it. You coordinated main independent clauses and created a compound sentence. And they are hierarchically the same. So, you have and, which joins she took the test and she passed it. But you can also coordinate subordinate clauses. He said he was worried and that they had to talk. So this big sentence contains the main clause he said, but this main clause is not coordinated with another main clause. Actually, this main clause has its object coordinated. So you have two subordinate clauses. He was worried, they had to talk, and you join these two clauses into a coordinated subordinate clause which functions as an object. And this big object contains two clauses. He was worried, subject, verb, subject, complement, and that they had to talk, which is subject and the verb introduced with the subordinator. And as you can see here, it's not uncommon for the coordinator to appear next to the subordinator. So and is a coordinator, and it's followed by a subordinator that they had to talk. So what this is a complex sentence. And you can see here the interplay of subordination and coordination. So the main subordinate sentence clause actually is he said, which has an object that is coordinated. So he said that he was worried and that they had to talk. You can see that the subordination creates the hierarchy, but as soon as you have the coordination, he was worried, they had to talk, are at the same level. How can you know that something is subordinated? Because it's introduced by a subordinator. So subordinators, these linkers, they are the elements that indicate that you are actually creating a subordinate clause. So, and there are many subordinators. Here are some groups: that, if, although, as, because, in order that, provided that, as soon as though, no sooner than, hardly, when, the moment, once, and zero. I know you like cookies. There's no subordinator. That's zero subordinator. or had he done that, he wouldn't have gotten injured. Where is the subordinator if for the conditional clause? There is no subordinator. The inversion, subject-object inversion, indicates that there is subordination. So the typical subordinators are single word subordinators, that, if, although. There are also multi-word subordinators, provided that, for example, we can do that, provided that they send us the specification. Correlative subordinators, no sooner had he touched the button than the engine started roaring. But you can also have marginal subordinators like noun phrases and adverbs. The moment I touch the button, a loud noise could be heard. Once I touch the button, loud noises could be heard. And of course, zero subordinators, which I just explained to you. So how this works? Well, let's take two simple sentences. I like Mary, Mary likes me. If you take a subordinator, because, and a coordinator, and, you will create two different structures. So I like Mary, that's the structure, and Mary likes me, that's the structure. MP, verb phrase, now NP again. So let's take and. If you take and, you create a compound sentence, and you say, I like Mary, and Mary likes me. This is a wonderful love story. Everybody loves everybody. And a compound sentence was created through the relationship of coordination with the coordinator and. However, because is not a coordinator, it's a subordinator. So if you take because, you cannot create fundamentally an equal status. You have to create a hierarchical structure. One sentence has to be superior, superordinate to the subordinate clause. So I like Mary's then the main clause, and then you create a subordinate clause because Mary likes me. So I don't really like Mary, but since she likes me, in the absence of a better choice, I like her. So this is not a nice love story. This is not true love. So with this, we actually finished the whole section on the introduction to the complex sentences, and we can tick this off. So we are done. But we are not done before I introduce you to a very modest homework. Unlike previous week's homework, where you had a lot of things to do, here I would just ask you to do the 8th exercise on page 144, which is about Concord, and then to start the warm-up exercises on pages 166. 1 and 2, exercise 1 and 2. The first one is about whether the sentences are simple, complex, and compound, which is also the topic of the previous section of our course. And in the second exercise, you are actually looking at complex sentences, and you have to find out which sentences inside those, which sentence elements inside those sentences are realized as clauses. So sometimes you will have a clause function as a subject, sometimes a clause function as an object, sometimes a clause function as an adverbial, etc. Sometimes even a clause function as a complement. So we are gradually going back to normal. We will have our midterm sometime in May. We will have the written and the oral exam sometime in June. Don't worry, don't be frustrated. So this will end gradually and relatively soon. It's not like we are in the United States where, this is the joke currently going around. You will be quarantined, unemployed, and dependent on government. So thank you for your time. We'll be YouTubing again in a week's time. Until then, so goodbye, stay safe, and see you sometime in May or June.